Man, we have another new novel on the go, Graham. War God.
We do indeed. Yes, I seem to be spreading my wings and writing in two different genres at the moment because I've by no means given up nonfiction, and I am in the early stages of work on a sequel to my best known book, which was called Fingerprints of the Gods, about the possibility of a lost civilization. But the novel writing is very close to my heart. And as you rightly said in the introduction, the impetus for beginning to write fiction at all came extraordinarily enough from visionary experiences with ayahuasca in Brazil. That's perhaps less unusual than it sounds, because but perhaps I don't know how many of your audience are familiar with ayahuasca, which means the vine of souls, and what it is. But it has influenced the work of many artists working in the medium of painting around the world. And while I'm not a painter, and I'm really quite useless at painting and drawing things, my particular gift, such as it is in the field of writing, and I definitely received a strong creative boost from working with ayahuasca, and a whole new line of thinking opened up for me, and that resulted in the first novel, Entangled, which was published in 2010. And now in War God. And it occurs to me that some ideas are simply so extraordinary that they cannot adequately be covered in the realm of non-fiction, where what you're presenting to your audience is facts, and that when you present a story as fact, there are certain conventions that you have to follow, and particularly if your story is a controversial one. I found, as the years went by and as academic responses to my works of non-fiction grew more hostile, because in the non-fiction realm, what I was suggesting was that there could have been a lost civilization more than 12,000 years ago, and this is an idea that's very annoying to many archaeologists who are convinced that civilization, is not more than 5,000 years old. It suggested that they'd got something wrong, and my nonfiction works were very controversial, I think it's fair to say, and came in for a lot of attacks and criticism, and this made me very defensive in my writing and made me bulletproof every argument and have large numbers, sometimes as many as 2,000 footnotes annexed to my increasingly lengthy nonfiction books, so that these attacks could be forestalled. And it's just an incredible freedom to be able to explore the extraordinary ideas that interest me in the realm of fiction, because then there is no need to put up a massively reinforced defensive argument. One can simply go ahead and say what one wants to say, and there is no possibility of furious critics attacking the book for being factually incorrect, since one is not pretending that it is factually correct. One's posture in writing a novel is that this is a work of fiction, this is a work of fantasy. But what I've found is that it's possible to put a huge amount of factual information into the fictional context, and at the same time explore it in extraordinary and interesting ways. And this is why, rather than writing a non-fiction book about the Spanish conquest of Mexico, I wrote War God, which is a novel and which is also a work of fantasy, even though it is underpinned throughout by facts of history, because there was an extraordinary element that I wish to explore in this story, which really would have been quite impossible to explore in nonfiction, and that is the question of the spiritual forces that are at work behind history. It is a simple fact that both Hernán Cortés, who was the Spanish conquistador who led the conquest of Mexico, and his opponent Moctezuma, the emperor of the Aztecs, were both men who believed that they were in contact with supernatural forces. I mean, this is a historical fact, but it's a modern critical academic would look at those beliefs of Cortés and Moctezuma and say that they were deluded, that they were, because of course from the point of view of modern academic criticism, there are no such things as supernatural forces. But I wanted to consider the possibility that Moctezuma and Cortés were not deluded, and that when they had their encounters with specific supernatural entities, there was a reality to those supernatural entities. And in the case of Moctezuma, that entity was the god who the Aztecs called Huitzilopochtli, which means hummingbird at the left hand of the sun, and he was the war god of the Aztecs. And Moctezuma, and again, this is his historical fact, believed himself to be in daily communication with this entity, whatever this entity was. And those communications were facilitated by the consumption on Moctezuma's part of psilocybin mushrooms, which put him into a deep visionary state. And in those trance states, he encountered this entity, this war god, who drove him on to acts of incredible violence and cruelty, and specifically a kind of almost serial killer delight in human sacrifice, which was a core function of ritual in Aztec society. Aztec society was extremely bloodthirsty, and human sacrifices were carried out in honor of the war god, sometimes on an incredibly massive scale. There were 80,000 people were sacrificed at the inauguration. Yeah, I mean, it's just an unbelievable amount. The lines of sacrificial victims stretched more than a mile to each of the 4 stairways of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan. And these victims were being sacrificed to inaugurate that pyramid. This was some 30 or 40 years before the reign of Moctezuma, with a previous Aztec emperor who was also in touch with this entity that they believed was their god of war. On the other side, Hernán Cortés was in dreams in contact with an entity that he believed was Saint Peter. Saint Peter had been the patron saint of Cortés since his childhood, and played a key role in his life. And what I'm showing in War God is that these dream encounters with the entity that he construed as Saint Peter also led Cortés to commit acts of extraordinary wickedness and violence, which he believed he was doing, or persuaded himself he was doing, in the name of God.
In a way, just as bad as Moctezuma.
Well, in some ways, a great deal worse. This is the intriguing thing. So, I mean, to give away a bit of the plot, but also to help listeners to understand why I decided to write this as fiction, because it allows an incredibly rich exploration of the implications of these supernatural encounters. What I'm suggesting is that the demonic entity that appeared to Moctezuma as the war god of the Aztecs, in another disguise, because these entities are shapeshifters, appeared to Cortés as Saint Peter, and that the purpose of demons throughout human history has been to maximize the misery of the human race, and to make things much darker and worse than they might otherwise be. And that's what we see in the events between 1519 and 1521, when the Spanish conquest of Mexico unfolded, that these two leaders, driven into frenzies of cruelty by their supernatural visionary encounters with these entities, multiplied and magnified human misery on an extraordinary scale in the Valley of Mexico. And while things were terribly bad under the Aztecs, they ultimately became 100,000 times worse under the Spanish. And it's just another of those facts of history that the population of Mexico declined from an estimated 30 million in 1519 on the eve of the conquest to less than 1 million barely 40 years later after the Spanish had taken control. So a gigantic genocide took place in that area. Events of terrible darkness unfolded, and this is the stage, this is the frame in which I set the story of War God. And it is not a story of unremitting misery and horror, because what redeems the story are the positive characters within it, both amongst the Native Americans and amongst the Spaniards, and their capacity for love and courage and human decency in a time of darkness.
Graham, so the core historical framework was drawn from history and personal accounts, and perhaps you've fictionalized or recreated some of the motives or the characters. Is that just to bring the reader back to this episode in history to deliver the story?
Yes, I mean, writing novels is to a large extent about character and also about plot. Now in this case, the essential plot is already provided by history, and it's a plot just so extraordinary that you literally couldn't make it up. I mean, what happened in those 2 years between 1519 and 1521 was on an epic scale, and it involved the collision of two cultures, and it changed the face of the world. And what took place at that time was just literally incredible. So I'm able to draw from the historical events to give a plot that is very real and based on events that actually happened, but that are yet extraordinary. As to characters, there are many historical characters, true historical characters, who play key roles in my story, such as Cortés himself, such as Moctezuma, and such as an extraordinary woman called Malinal, who is a known historical figure. She actually became the mistress of Cortés in Mexico. But for some, she is a Native American woman, and her origins are somewhat obscure. But her key characteristic, what allowed her to become important in history, is that she spoke two languages. She spoke Maya, the language of the Yucatan Peninsula, where the ancient Mayan civilization flourished, and where indeed there are still Maya-speaking people today. And she also spoke Nahuatl, which was the language of the Aztecs. And Nahuatl is also still spoken today. Malinal spoke both of these languages, and for some reason, which history does not provide us with the answer to, but which I was able to, as a novelist, I was able to make it comprehensible to the reader why this was the case. For some reason, Malinal had a huge grudge against Moctezuma, the Aztec emperor. And what we know of Malinal from history was that she was born into an aristocratic family, but that her father was a minor king of an outlying group of people, not in the center of the Aztec Empire, but in an outlying area, and that she would have been the successor of that king, but the king died. And when Malinal was still a child, and Malinal's mother remarried another man and had a male child by him, and they decided to get rid of Malinal so that male child would have the inheritance, and she was sold into slavery. This is historical fact. Well, in my novel, I have her effectively a sex slave for the Aztecs as a young woman, and then through a series of events prepared for human sacrifice. And this was very common in Aztec society. So we first encounter her in what are called the fattening pens in Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan was the capital of the Aztec Empire, and it stands on the site of what is now Mexico City. In those days, in 1519, Tenochtitlan actually stood on an island in the midst of a great lake called Lake Texcoco, and it was approached by causeways, sometimes as much as 6 miles long, crossing the waters of that lake. Today, of course, Mexico City has no lake. The whole lake has been drained, but this is the location of Tenochtitlan. So we encounter Malinal in the fattening pen. This is where, again, this is another gruesome feature of Aztec society, that when people were to be sacrificed, they would first of all fatten them up so that they would be, in the Aztec concept, very strange, so that they would be desirable to the god before they were led up the pyramid and their hearts were brutally cut out of their chests. And this is where we meet Malinal waiting for her death, having fallen foul of the high priest who used her for sex, which was against his vows, because the high priests of the Aztecs were supposed to be celibates. This is the background to the plot.
Do we know why they embarked on the human sacrifice as a civilization? Do we know why that? Was it due to one person kickstarting this all off?
Well, I mean, if you look at their, as it were, the official accounts of the Aztecs as to why they were killing people on the execution stone, part of it is to do with a belief that the end of the world was imminent. And that in order to prevent the end of the world, and specifically the death of the sun, with whom the war god Huitzilopochtli was intimately associated, they would offer up the vital force of human hearts and blood to rejuvenate and nourish and maintain the sun for another day or another year. But if you go deeper, you find that there are constant references to these visionary encounters with entities who are urging the Aztecs to murder and kill in this way. And without those visionary encounters, it's difficult to imagine that they would ever have gone down this road. So this is the reason for it, and this is why I think it's a very interesting story to tell. If I could come back to the issue of Malinal, and she is one of the two heroines of my story. We meet her in the fattening pens in the company of another young woman, a young witch with supernatural powers which are not yet fully developed, called Tozy, who's also going to be sacrificed. And to cut a long story short, they escape from the sacrificial predicament. And while Tozy stays in Tenochtitlan to work harm against Moctezuma, Malinal goes to the coast. And the reason she goes to the coast is because there was a belief at that time, and again, this is one of the mysterious aspects of the story that you just couldn't make up, and it's very, very much a historical fact. There was a belief at that time that a god of peace called Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, would be returning to Mexico, having been driven out long before in some distant epoch by the forces of evil and darkness. That this god of peace, Quetzalcoatl, who was completely against human sacrifice, would be returning, and that he would return in the year in the Aztec calendar that was called One Reed. The Aztec calendar is rather like the Chinese calendar. I think everybody's familiar with the Chinese calendar and the fact that there are 12 named years, the year of the rat, the year of the snake, the year of the tiger, and so on and so forth. And it was very similar with the Aztec calendar, except it wasn't 12 named years, it was 52 named years, and they revolved in a great cycle. And in a year One Reed, not specified in which cycle it would occur, there was a prophecy that the god Quetzalcoatl would return to abolish human sacrifice and to overthrow a wicked king. And it just happened that at exactly the time that the Spanish conquest began, it was the year one reed. 1519 was the year one reed.
In a way, Quetzalcoatl came back, Graham.
Well, in a way, he came back, but in a terrible, dark, vengeful, violent form. And I think if there's anything that we in the modern age can learn from all of this, it is because there has been much talk. There was much talk around the 21st of December 2012 of a rebirth of human consciousness and of the return of Quetzalcoatl again. That we don't need to make the mistakes that our ancestors made, and we don't need to repeat the cycle of violence and wickedness that has been imposed upon the human race. But at any rate, Malinal went to the coast in hope that she would encounter this god of peace and that she would be able to work with him to bring about the end of this awful regime of human sacrifice. And lo and behold, when she gets to the coast, and again, this is historical fact, she's actually taken prisoner by the Maya. And this is at exactly the time that Cortés arrives in Mexico with 490 men. And again, here you have a scenario that it would be impossible to make up. The Aztecs have a standing army of 200,000 men. They are an extraordinarily brutal militaristic power. They are like Hitler's Germany in Mexico in the 16th century. They're a war machine. And on their coast arrive 11 ships containing 490 Spaniards. And at first, the odds seem absolutely insuperable. How can such a tiny group of men possibly hope to overthrow an empire on this scale? Incredibly
brave too to be doing that, Graham.
Yeah, I have to say that I have many reservations about the Spaniards. They were extremely negative and cruel in many ways, but they were also men of their time. And we have to remember that in those times, in the 16th century, ethics were completely different from ethics today. In those times, might was right. If you had the force, if you had the power, then you used it to take from others. And that was not considered to be wrong. It was just the way things were and the way they had been for a very long time. And I have to pay tribute to the astonishing courage of this small group of Spaniards who turn up on this hostile coast, not really knowing exactly what it is they're going to confront, but pretty soon finding out what it is. And they first of all make contact with the Maya. They land on the island of Cozumel, a well-known holiday resort today. And they then sail round the thumb of the Yucatan and come down on the Tabasco River, and that's where Cortés has his first major military encounter. And I show in the book that he's driven on to seek out this encounter by his visionary encounters with the entity that he construes as Saint Peter, who is demonic, who is the same entity, in fact, that is misleading Moctezuma. And there Cortés confronts a gigantic Mayan army of at least 50,000 men. And, the odds seem absolutely insuperable. How could he possibly hope to win that battle? He has no allies whatsoever. There's just him and his 490 Spaniards. But they have a number of advantages. They have something quite incomprehensible to the indigenous people. They have dogs that are used as weapons of war. They have 100 wolfhounds and mastiffs with them. And these dogs are trained to kill. And they dress them up in armor. So they're huge, savage killer dogs. And they have 100 of those, dressed in shining armor of metal plate and chainmail. And dogs were known in Central America, but there was no dog larger than the Chihuahua.
Bit of a difference there, Graham.
A bit of a difference, and these dogs in Central America were used as food items, and they didn't even bark. So the only concept of the dog that was there in Central America was of this passive food item that about the size of a Chihuahua. So initially, when they saw the Spanish war dogs, they had no idea what they were dealing with. They thought they were some sort of dreadful supernatural being. They described them as dragons, actually. And then secondly, the Spanish had another colossal advantage, and that was a small corps of cavalry. Horses had been extinct in the New World for more than 12,000 years when Cortés turned up. There had been horses in the Americas, but they went extinct at the end of the last ice age about 12,000 years ago. So there was no memory whatsoever of horses or what horses were. The Spanish had with them 16 heavy horse, 16 destriers, these massive horses that were used for cavalry charges. And again, the horses as well as the men were armored in steel. So you have to picture this huge horse, which is covered in gleaming steel, and on its back is mounted a warrior with a steel sword, dressed in steel armor. And in the eyes of the Maya who first encountered this cavalry, they just had absolutely no idea what they were dealing with. They could not place it in any frame of reference. They understood that the horses looked somewhat like deer, and the men were mounted upon their backs. Now, were the men sitting on the deer, or was this some kind of extraordinary supernatural hybrid creature that they were encountering, which was like a centaur, which was part deer,
anthropomorphic,
and exactly, and part man. They just weren't sure. And then the speed of these things, that they come charging down at you in a close knit group at about 30 miles an hour, with their hooves thundering on the ground and making the earth tremble, and mounted upon them these warriors with lances, again steel tipped lances. This was just a shocking, terrifying sight to the Maya, and they had no tactics to deal with it. European armies had been dealing with cavalry charges. European infantry had been dealing with cavalry charges for thousands of years, and they had developed very specific tactics to deal with cavalry charges. The Maya had no such tactics. They were thrown into utter disarray. And then the third thing that gave the Spanish, another thing that gave the Spanish an advantage, was the possession of guns. And these guns were of two types. They had a very primitive musket called the arquebus. Took about a minute to reload and fire each shot with that. They had about 50 of those with them. And they had cannon, a number of small cannon called falconets, and a number of larger cannon called lombards. These also were totally unknown weapons in the Americas. They had never seen anything like a firearm, but they did have traditions of the gods having a weapon that were called fire serpents, which dismembered and destroyed men and made loud noises and emitted clouds of smoke, which was exactly what the guns did. So in every way, this Spanish force looked like a supernatural force to those who first met them. And as a result, in that first big battle at Potonchan, Cortés was able, it wasn't easy. The Maya were not cowards, even though they were confronting this most unusual and terrifying spectacle. Mm-hmm. The Maya put up a massive fight, and for a while it looked as though Cortés' infantry would be destroyed, but then he came into the battle from behind with his cavalry, and at the same time the war dogs were unleashed. And suddenly the whole Mayan force collapsed into a rout. And you have to imagine cannon firing, grape shot whistling amongst their ranks, these huge cannonballs from the Lombards bouncing along, destroying 100, 200 men at a time. Just an absolutely shattering experience. And in the end, Cortés carried the day. And he would...
Sorry, Graham. They really believed in the science that they had, didn't they? That's what drove them. They really believed in their military might and their science and technology.
The Spaniards did believe in their military science. They were. This is the other difference between them and the forces they faced in Central America, is that for them, warfare was a science, and they had carefully thought out tactics, and these were all hardened men. Spain, you have to remember, had just gone through 700 years of conflict with Islam. Spain had been occupied by Arab forces, large parts of Spain, and there took place a campaign called the Reconquista, where the Spanish gradually reconquered their territory from Arab occupation. And this had ended, the final battle of the Reconquista was not long before the conquest of Mexico. So these men were hardened in warfare. They'd also had experience of war in Italy, in the Italian wars, and so they were a hardened, formidable force who knew exactly what they were doing and who did not break or panic easily, and who counted upon one another and who counted upon their skills and their tactics, and whose whole objective in warfare was to utterly destroy the enemy on the battlefield with just ruthless, single-minded focus. Whereas both for the Maya and the Aztecs, a battle was a place to take prisoners who would then be carried off and at a later date sacrificed. So their tactics in warfare were actually not really to kill the enemy on the battlefield, but to disable the enemy and take them prisoner. And this cost them dear when they came up against the ruthless killing machine of the Spaniards, who had no such ideas at all, who were just there to utterly wipe them out, and that's what they did. So we have this giant battle at Potonchan, and then Cortés accepts the surrender of the Mayan chiefs, and this is where he encounters Malinal, the heroine who I spoke of earlier, because she'd been taken prisoner by the Maya on her way down to the coast, pursuing the dream of meeting the god of peace, Quetzalcoatl, and 20 women were handed over by the Maya to Cortés to serve as cooks and servants and bed companions, and one of them was this woman Malinal, and this is where she injects herself into history, because
she's the key to this whole saga. Really.
She's the key to the whole saga, because without her, it is very unlikely that Cortés would have succeeded in conquering the Aztecs. She gave Cortés key information which he needed, and she played a very key role, and this is recognized to this day in Mexico, where the name of Malinal, who's the heroine of my story, in Mexico today, Malinal is regarded as a traitor. If you call somebody a Malinchist in Mexico, it's the equivalent to calling them a traitor, because she was considered to have handed over her land and people to the invaders, and she has a bad reputation in Mexico today, which I hope my story will go some way towards rehabilitating, because she was an extraordinary, and I hope so. She was an extraordinary and remarkable character. At any rate, sorry, I have to give the background to this. It's a little bit lengthy, but bear with me. When Cortés first landed in the Yucatan, he had an extraordinary, where everybody spoke the Mayan language, he had an extraordinary stroke of luck, which was that a Spaniard had been shipwrecked there some 11 years before. And that Spaniard had been one of a group of 26, 25 of whom were sacrificed and eaten by the Maya, because cannibalism was practiced throughout this region. But one, whose name was Aguilar, was kept alive in a rather humiliating role, serving a Mayan chief. And this Aguilar had been amongst the Maya for 11 years and thus spoke fluent Maya as well as Spanish. And when Cortés heard that there was somebody who looked a bit like him held prisoner in one of the Mayan villages, he went and grabbed this guy. And Aguilar became Cortés's first interpreter, and in all his encounters with the Maya, Aguilar did the key role of interpreting. And this was very important because Cortés was an incredibly cunning and clever man, and he used language, he used speech, he used the power of persuasion very effectively to secure his dominance. So having a good interpreter was really important to him. But after he dealt with the Maya and accepted their surrender and received these 20 women, amongst them Malinal, as his as a gift from the Maya, he moved on down the coast. He'd heard by then detailed rumors of the Aztecs, and they had something he wanted. The Aztecs had gold. It was gold that drove the Spanish conquest of Mexico more than anything else. And here's just one of those funny things. The Maya were not that interested in gold. The Maya liked jade. Jade was very important to them. For the Spanish, they just saw it as some kind of green stone that had no attraction to them. And they were a bit disappointed at the limited amounts of gold they managed to extract from the Maya after defeating them. But there were these rumors of this huge empire which was rich in gold, and Cortés decided to go on and take that empire on. So he sailed on down the coast, and he came to the first town that was part of the Aztec Empire. And he landed there and found himself in a position where he couldn't speak to them, because suddenly his interpreter, who spoke Maya, didn't speak a word of Nahuatl, the Aztec language. And they were getting along very badly with sign language and gestures when the woman Malinal, who was carrying pots at that point and working in the kitchens, put herself forward and made it clear that she spoke both Maya and Nahuatl. And Cortés immediately grasped what this meant, that he could now speak to the Aztecs. He would give his words to Aguilar, the Spanish shipwreck. Aguilar would put them into the Mayan language to Malinal. Malinal would then translate them into Nahuatl so that the Aztecs could understand them, and the reverse process would occur. So with these two interpreters, Cortés could suddenly speak to the Aztecs. And again, this is a historical fact. Very quickly, Malinal learnt the Spanish language, and it was possible for her to dispense with Aguilar within a few months. She didn't need him anymore. As an intermediary, she could speak Spanish directly to Cortés and serve as effectively as his tongue. And in every image now that we see of Cortés, and many have survived from the Aztec time because the Aztecs made a lot of paintings, in every image of him that has survived, we see Malinal standing by his side, and we see the glyph for speech coming out of her mouth. And she becomes his confidant, his interpreter, and his lover. And she also becomes his advisor. And this is where she gives him the key information that he's going to need in order to defeat Moctezuma. And that is the story of Quetzalcoatl, of the returning deity. And by some mystical process, by some extraordinary coincidence, Cortés and his army have turned up in the year 1 Reed, when Quetzalcoatl was expected to return, and moreover, they look like Quetzalcoatl, because there were these traditions amongst the Aztecs that Quetzalcoatl had been a white-skinned, bearded deity, armed with formidable weapons, who would return from across the seas in a boat that moved by itself without paddles. And Cortés and the Spanish, with their sailing ships, just perfectly fitted the bill. And Malinal's advice to Cortés was that he should not pretend to be Quetzalcoatl. He should always say what he was, but he should leave it to the imaginations of the Aztecs to fill in the gaps. They would think he was Quetzalcoatl, whatever he said, because they regarded their gods as tricksters. And this is what happened in the initial part of the encounter. Moctezuma was convinced that he was dealing with this returning deity. And Cortés, of course, was massively opposed to human sacrifice. And this was, again, what was expected of Quetzalcoatl, that he would be opposed to human sacrifice. The old legend said that he was a god who put his fingers in his ears at any talk of human sacrifice, and who had ruled that people should only sacrifice flowers and never human hearts and blood. So Cortés, even though he was a warrior and a killer, and there's a famous song by Neil Young actually called Cortés the Killer, which fits the bill perfectly, because he was a ruthless, awesome predator. He nevertheless was able to don this mantle of Quetzalcoatl, and Moctezuma, who'd been carrying out horrific human sacrifices at his own hands, began to feel that he himself, Moctezuma, fitted the bill of the prophecy as the wicked king who would be overthrown by Quetzalcoatl. And he felt somehow that his own wickedness was what explained the incredible cruelty and ferocity of the Spaniards. And it took Moctezuma and the Aztecs quite a long time to figure out for sure that they weren't actually dealing with gods at all. They were dealing with men just like them, but formidably armed and dangerous men. The impetus for beginning to write fiction at all came extraordinarily enough from visionary experiences with ayahuasca in Brazil. That's perhaps less unusual than it sounds, because perhaps I don't know how many of your audience are familiar with ayahuasca, which means the vine of souls, and what it is. But it has influenced the work of many artists working in the medium of painting around the world. And while I'm not a painter, and I'm really quite useless at painting and drawing things, my particular gift, such as it is in the field of writing, and I definitely received a strong creative boost from working with ayahuasca, and a whole new line of thinking opened up for me, and that resulted in the first novel intact for a lot of attacks and criticism, and this made me very defensive in my writing and made me bulletproof every argument and have large numbers, sometimes as many as 2,000 footnotes annexed to my increasingly lengthy nonfiction books, so that these attacks could be forestalled. And it's just an incredible freedom to be able to explore the extraordinary ideas that interest me in the realm of fiction, because then there is no need to put up a massively reinforced defensive argument. One can simply go ahead and say what one wants to say, and there is no possibility of furious critics attacking the book for being factually incorrect, since one is not pretending that it is factually correct. One's posture in writing a novel is that this is a work of fiction, this is a work of fantasy. But what I've found is that it's possible to put a huge amount of factual information into the fictional context, and at the same time explore it in extraordinary and interesting ways. And this is why, rather than writing a non-fiction book about the Spanish conquest of Mexico, I wrote War God, which is a novel and which is also a work of fantasy, even though it is underpinned throughout by facts of history, because there was an extraordinary element that I wished to explore in this story, which really would have been quite impossible to explore in nonfiction, and that is the question of the spiritual forces that are at work behind history. It is a simple fact that both Hernán Cortés, who was the Spanish conquistador who led the conquest of Mexico, and his opponent Moctezuma, the emperor of the Aztecs, were both men who believed that they were in contact with supernatural forces.
Man, we have another new novel on the go, Graham. War God.
We do indeed, yes. I seem to be I seem to be spreading my wings and writing in two different genres at the moment, because I've by no means given up nonfiction, and I am in the early stages of work on a sequel to my best known book, which was called Fingerprints of the Gods, about the possibility of a lost civilization. But the novel writing is very close to my heart. And as you rightly said in the introduction, which was published in 2010, and now in War God. And it occurs to me that some ideas are simply so extraordinary that they cannot adequately be covered in the realm of non-fiction, where what you're presenting to your audience is facts, and that when you present a story as fact, there are certain conventions that you have to follow, and particularly if your story is a controversial one. I found, as the years went by and as academic responses to my works of non-fiction grew more hostile, because in the non-fiction realm, what I was suggesting was that there could have been a lost civilization more than 12,000 years ago, and this is an idea that's very annoying to many archaeologists who are convinced that civilization, is not more than 5,000 years old. It suggested that they'd got something wrong, and my non-fiction works were very controversial, I think it's fair to say, and came in